A screenplay in three-part. Characters: Dorothea Winslow, 74, retired senior title underwriter. Houston, Texas, Clifton Winslow. Her late husband referenced throughout: Pamela Winslow, Breck, 40. Their daughter, attorney Garrett Breck, 42. Pamela's husband, boutique real estate developer, Addie, 6. Their daughter, Dorothea's granddaughter. Sylvia, mourning attorney. Clifton's longtime friend and successor. Trustee, Fletcher Odom. 78, retired judge. Clifton's oldest friend. Warren Prudhoe, private investor, Garrett's business partner. Bet neighbors. Dorothea's neighbor of 26 years. The phone rang at 7:42 on a Tuesday evening while the first fat drops of an autumn storm were just beginning to streak the kitchen window. Dorothea Winslow was at the sink rinsing the last of her dinner dishes, watching the courtyard darken through the glass, thinking about nothing in particular, and everything at once, the way a woman alone often does in the quiet hours after the day has settled. The courtyard was hers alone now. The garden she and Clifton had planted together and tended together and argued pleasantly about for 40 years, the satsuma tree, at the center of it, gone dark in the evening light, and its small green fruit invisible in the gathering shadows. She had been thinking about the tree, actually, about whether it needed the fertilizer the man at the nursery had recommended, and the thought had been pleasant enough, grounded in the ordinary, the kind of thought that keeps the other thoughts at bay. She almost let it go to voicemail. She was glad she didn't. Dot. It was Bet Neighbors, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who doesn't want to alarm but knows they must. Bet lived 3 doors down on the same Timber Grove street in Houston where Dorothea had raised her daughter, buried her husband, and grown old into herself. They had been neighbors for 26 years, and Bet knew the difference between Dorothea's granddaughter playing outside and a child who shouldn't be sitting alone on a wet curb. There's a little one out front of Pamela's place. Pink jacket. She's been there a good while. I walked by twice and thought maybe she was waiting on something, but it's coming on to rain hard now, and she's just sitting there. Dorothea set down the dish and turned off the faucet. I'm on my way, she said. She didn't rush, not exactly, but she moved with the particular economy of a woman who has learned that urgency and panic are not the same thing. She pulled on her coat, took her keys from the hook by the door, and backed the Buick out of her driveway into a rain that was already thickening into something determined. The streets of Timber Grove were quiet in the way they got on weeknight evenings in October, the neighborhood folding inward around itself, the porch lights coming on in the houses she passed. She had driven this route hundreds of times. It was the route to her daughter's house, the route to Sunday dinners and birthday parties, and the ordinary geography of a family's life. She drove it now with different eyes. Pamela and Garrett's house in River Oaks was 11 minutes away. Dorothea drove it in 8. She saw Addie from half a block out. A small shape in a bright pink jacket on the curb at the edge of the driveway, her sneakers dark with wet, her shoulders rounded against the rain in the particular way of a small person trying to make themselves smaller. Through the tall windows of the house behind her, warm light bloomed amber and gold. Dorothea could make out the silhouettes of people moving, the elongated shapes of adults holding drinks, talking, laughing. The music she could hear even from the street, something jazzy and assured. Inside there was a party. Out here her granddaughter was sitting in the rain and nobody had noticed. She thought as she drove about what it meant to build something. Clifton had used that word build more than any other man she had known. He used it for houses and for arguments and for relationships and for the particular kind of trust that accumulates between two people over years of small decisions. He had been a builder in the most fundamental sense, a man who understood that the things that lasted were the things that were made deliberately with attention from good materials, over time. He had not been flashy about it. He had not announced his intentions. He had simply built steadily in the direction of a future that was better than the present for the people he loved. Garrett built too in his way. He built quickly with borrowed capital and optimistic timelines in the direction of a future that was better for Garrett. Dorothea had understood the difference when Clifton was alive, in the vague way that you understand differences that do not yet matter. She was understanding it now with a specificity that came from reading the actual documents. The rain was heavier by the time she pulled onto Pamela Street. The lights were on in all the River Oaks houses, the warm domestic light that made everything look stable from the outside. She had spent a professional's lifetime understanding that the most unstable things sometimes had the warmest light in the windows. Dorothea pulled the car alongside the curb and pushed open the passenger door. Addie, baby. she said, her voice softer than she intended. Addie looked up. In the dim light, her face was small and still and very serious, the way children's faces are when they are holding themselves together by concentration alone. Then she saw her grandmother, and the concentration cracked open into something raw and relieved, a 6-year-old's face doing in an instant what adults spend lifetimes trying to manage, showing exactly what it felt. She scrambled to her feet and ran, climbing into the passenger seat and pulling the door shut behind her as if escaping something. Dorothea had a spare throw blanket from the back seat around her shoulders before Addie had drawn a second breath. She smelled of rain and dryer sheets and the faint sweetness of the shampoo Pamela used on her hair. 6 years old, and she had sat in the rain without crying, without knocking on her own front door, without calling for anyone. That stillness frightened Dorothea more than tears would have. Tears meant a child who believed someone would come. Stillness meant a child who had been told to wait. "I thought you were gone, Nana," Addie said, her voice muffled in the fleece. "I had to go home after the party, but I came back." "Why are you outside, sweet girl?" Addie looked down at her hands, picking at a loose thread on the blanket. The dashboard lights cast soft shadows on her face, making her look younger than she was, and older at the same time, a child with something careful sitting behind her eyes. "Uncle Garrett said I had to wait out here," she said. "He said I was making too much noise and the grown-ups were talking business." A pause. "He said if I was a good girl and sat quiet, you'd be happy." Another pause, shorter, more careful, the pause of a child relaying something she does not fully understand but senses is important. "He said you'd sign the papers if I behaved." Dorothea's hands did not move on the steering wheel. For 34 years, she had worked as a senior title underwriter for a firm whose name was known in every county courthouse, from Houston to the Louisiana border. Her job had been to read the history of land, to trace ownership backward through generations of deeds and liens and probate records, looking for the place where something had gone wrong. A misapplied signature, a forged release, an heir nobody had thought to name. The work required a specific kind of patience, a capacity to hold very still while the picture assembled itself. You did not startle. You did not react. You read. She was reading now. "Sign the papers." The words sat in the warm air of the car, simple as anything spoken in the voice of a 6-year-old who did not understand them. They did not need to be understood. They only needed to be heard. A child does not invent that kind of sentence. A child repeats what she has been told in the order, and waits she has been told it with the earnest accuracy of a small person, trying to get the information right. Clifton had always said she had a gift for finding the flaw in the foundation. That was how he put it, not as a complaint, but as a plain statement of fact delivered with the quiet pride of a man who understood that the people who made the world run were the ones who read things carefully before signing them. She had thought about those words many times since he died. She thought about them now, sitting in the car with her granddaughter, the rain coming down in earnest. The party visible through the tall windows of the house where nobody had yet noticed the child was gone. "I think you left your dinosaur backpack inside," Dorothea said. "The blue one." She kept her voice light, the voice of a grandmother on a perfectly ordinary errand. "I'm going to run in and grab it for you. You stay right here, lock the doors, and keep warm." Addie nodded, already pulling the blanket tighter, already drooping towards sleep, with the total confidence of a child who has been told by someone she trusts that everything is now all right. Dorothea stepped out into the rain. The iron gate at the end of the front path opened with a low groan she had always associated with this house, with the years of Sunday dinners and holiday parties, and the particular brand of warmth Garrett Breck had worked very hard to manufacture. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with the kind of face that filled out well in photographs and improved further in memory. He spoke of building things. Legacy, he said often, the words sitting comfortably in his mouth as if he had been born to it. Investment in the future. He meant it. That was the thing about Garrett that had always made him difficult to distrust. He genuinely meant everything he said. He had simply learned to say things that meant different things to different people in the same room at the same time. She let herself in. She was still family after all. The house was warm, loud with jazz she didn't recognize, thick with the smell of wine and something roasting in the kitchen. The living room was filled with people she mostly didn't know, men in expensive casual wear, holding glasses with the practiced ease of people who had been holding glasses at parties since business school. Women in silk blouses laughing at precisely the right moments with the professional warmth of people who understood that social capital was capital. Near the fireplace, she saw a man she recognized from a name Garrett had mentioned in passing over the past several months, almost Warren Prudhoe. Warren Prudhoe was the kind of man whose posture announced itself before he spoke. He stood with his back very straight and his eyes moving around the room in that particular way that real estate developers and certain kinds of lenders had cataloging square footage, estimating value, running the numbers behind a perfectly pleasant expression. He was not Dorothea noted doing the thing that the other men at the party were doing, which was performing enjoyment. He was working. Beside him was another man in a suit the color of a storm sky, younger, attentive, in the way of someone whose job tonight was to listen and report back. Pamela materialized at Dorothea's elbow. Her daughter looked beautiful and exhausted in the way she often did at these evenings of Garrett's, a performance of ease that Dorothea recognized as costing her considerably. Pamela had her father's eyes and her mother's jaw in the particular competence of a woman who had become very good at managing the space between who she was and who a situation required her to be. "Mom, I thought you'd left." The words were smooth, immediate, exactly right. Dorothea had heard them before in the car, less than an hour ago, in the mouth of a child. Now here they were again, slightly different in inflection on the lips of her daughter, and they sounded exactly as rehearsed. Two people saying the same sentence in the same house on the same evening. One of them didn't know what it meant. Dorothea was no longer certain about the other. "Addie forgot her backpack," Dorothea said pleasantly. "I'll just grab it and get out of your way." At the far end of the room, Garrett turned and saw her. His smile was instantaneous and practiced the smile he kept ready, like a good handshake, warm and calibrated to the relationship. He raised a hand in greeting, and Dorothea raised one back, already moving toward the hallway with the unhurried purpose of a woman on a grandmother's errand. She found the backpack in the hall closet where Addie always left it, the blue one with the cartoon dinosaur that Addie had chosen with enormous seriousness from a display of 23 options. On the way back through the corridor, she passed the door to Garrett's home office. It was not quite closed. A thin rectangle of lamplight cut across the dark hall like a seam in a floor plan, precise and illuminating. She stopped. She stood still for 3 seconds, which is a very long time when you are listening to a party on one side of you and a silence on the other. 3 seconds is long enough for a trained eye to do its work. Then she turned and looked through the gap in the door. His desk was the kind of mahogany that photographs well large and precisely ordered and designed to communicate authority in the specific register of a man who has built things worth displaying. The brass lamp on its corner threw a focused circle of warm light onto the center of the surface, and there, precisely centered in that light, as though placed for an inspection, it was never meant to receive, was a thick stack of documents in a dark blue cover. She read the title without moving any closer. Winslow Breck Family Compound LLC Partnership Agreement. Her name, her daughter's name, the name of a company she had never heard of, rendered in clean, confident letterhead. She did not touch it. She did not need to. She had read enough documents in enough offices over 34 years to know what she was looking at from across a room. This was not a conversation. This was not a dream floated over Sunday dinner. This was a legal instrument fully formed, already drafted by someone's attorneys, and it was sitting on her son-in-law's desk under a lamp pointed at it like a spotlight, waiting for the last signature it needed. She took the backpack and walked back through the party. The jazz was louder now. Garrett turned to say something pleasant as she passed. She gave him the same warm grandmother's smile she had walked in with, told him the food smelled wonderful, and that she hoped the rest of his evening was everything he was hoping for. She let herself out the front gate with the unhurried manner of a woman who has retrieved a dinosaur backpack and completed a simple errand, and walked back to the car where her granddaughter was already asleep against the window, her small mouth slightly open, her hands still folded around the corner of the blanket. Dorothea sat for a moment with the engine off. The rain moved across the windshield in steady, determined lines. The party went on inside the house, lit and warm and purposeful. She looked at it for a long moment, at the life inside those windows, and understood that the gap between what she had believed and what was actually true had been open for some time, and she had simply not been looking at the right angle. She put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. She set Addie in the guest room with the blue quilt, stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment the way grandmothers stand in doorways, and then went to the kitchen table. Not to eat, not to do anything, just to sit in the chair where Clifton had drunk his morning coffee for 40 years in the room where his presence was still strongest, and think about a date. October 17th, 2019, 11 months before Clifton died. They had gone together to Sylvia Morning's office in Midtown Clifton, walking slowly using his cane wearing his good blazer, because he always wore his good blazer when the occasion required dignity. He had been a man who believed in the appropriate weight of clothing for the appropriate occasion, a belief Dorothea had found gently old-fashioned when they met, and had come to understand as a form of respect she missed now in ways she hadn't expected. They had amended the trust they had set up years before. Clifton had been specific, methodical, unusually so, even for him. He had sat across from Sylvia with a list handwritten on a legal pad, which was unlike him. He usually held things in his head, but that afternoon he had the list, and he went through it carefully, and when he got to the clause about the successor trustee, he had looked up and said something that had surprised her. "I want Sylvia named as successor trustee," he had said, "not because I don't trust Pamela, because I don't trust who Pamela might marry." He had said it with a slight smile, self-deprecating, almost apologetic, the smile of a man who knows he may be overcautious and has decided to be overcautious anyway. But his eyes had been serious and very steady. "I want a clause that protects the land from commercial encumbrance. No collateral. No third-party development deals without unanimous trustee approval. The land stays land for as long as we need it to stay land." He had signed the document with the deliberate pressure of a man making something permanent, his hand barely trembling, despite the medication. Dorothea had thought at the time it was excessive. Garrett had been part of the family for 4 years by then. He was charming and capable, and clearly devoted to Pamela, and she had thought sitting in that office that Clifton's caution was the caution of a man who had spent too many years reading about what other men's sons-in-law had done to other men's families. She had not said so. She was profoundly glad now that she had not said so. 3 days after the party, Garrett called on a Wednesday morning. She was watering her ferns in the kitchen window, the late light coming through in long gold columns, and she let the phone ring twice while she decided how to answer. She answered with her usual voice, the warm, unguarded voice of a woman who is at home and has nothing to prepare. "Dorothea." Warm, expansive, leaning slightly on the first syllable, the way he did when he was building towards something. "How are you doing? I've been meaning to call and see how you're settling into the fall." "I'm well, Garrett. What can I do for you?" "Good news on the compound project. The preliminary plans from the architect came back and they're really something. The way he's designed it, we'd be able to build something that genuinely honors what you and Clifton created here while creating dedicated space for the next generation." He paused to let that land. He was good at pausing. The word Clifton was placed with surgical care, the name dropped into the sentence at the moment of maximum resonance, like a coin dropped into still water. "I actually have the partnership documents ready for you to review. Nothing complex, just the formal framework to get the assets pooled so we can move forward with the architect. I could bring them by this afternoon if you are free." "This afternoon is fine," she said. Her knuckles were white around the handle of the watering can, but her voice was level and warm and entirely ordinary. He arrived at 3. His car, a large black thing that sat on the narrow Timber Grove street with the ease of something that had never needed to consider whether it belonged, was parked at the curb when she looked out the window. He carried a briefcase she recognized as Italian leather, the kind that communicated a certain category of success. He wore a suit that said with quiet authority that he was doing you a courtesy by being here. He set the document on her cypress dining table with the careful placement of someone presenting something they believed to be a gift. The cypress table Clifton had built himself in the garage over one long winter, fitting the planks together by hand, sanding each one smooth with a ear that Dorothea had watched from the doorway on a dozen cold evenings. Clifton had been proud of that table in the way he was proud of most things he made quietly and without needing to say so. The document sat on it now the way something foreign sits in a familiar place, taking up space that belonged to something else. Winslow Breck Family Compound, ALLC. The same blue cover she had read through the gap in the office door. He explained the basics with the smooth fluency of a man who had explained this before to other people in other rooms and had refined the explanation to its most reassuring form. The 4 parcels in Timber Grove, including her shotgun house and the three adjacent lots Clifton had assembled over 3 decades of careful, quiet work would be contributed to the LLC as her capital contribution. Garrett's company would provide the construction financing. Pamela would co-manage the build. Dorothea would have her new granny flat with the courtyard garden he had showed her in the renderings, everything she had, and more, everything protected, everything clean and legal. I had my attorneys drafted with your interests fully secured, he said, tapping the cover with one manicured finger. Blackwood and Finch, the best firm in the city for this kind of work. I'll need time to read it, she said. Of course, of course. He checked his watch with the unhurried manner of a man who is not actually checking the time, but signaling that time is a factor. We're hoping to have everything signed by Friday. There's a bank deadline on the bridge loan for the initial construction financing. Just a formality, but deadlines are deadlines. That was the third time he had used that word. Formality, a word people use to make important things sound small, to create the impression that the thing requiring your signature is merely an administrative step rather than a legal instrument that will determine the disposition of the most valuable assets you own. After he left, she made tea she didn't drink and sat down with the document. For the next 3 hours, she was not a grandmother or a widow or a woman whose son-in-law had just asked her to sign something on her husband's table. She was Dorothea Winslow, senior title underwriter, retired but not unretired, and there was work to be done. She read the way she had always read from the beginning, linearly, without skipping, without trusting the summary at the front to accurately represent the substance in the middle. She made small marks on a legal pad beside her questions, cross-references points where the language of one section seemed to pull against the language of another. Much of it was exactly as described. Standard LLC formation, language clean and professionally drafted. Capital contribution schedules that clearly identified her parcels and their assessed values. Management rights distributed between herself and Pamela and Garrett's company in proportions that looked reasonable, until you noticed that operational control rested entirely with the managing member, which was Garrett's company, and that the managing member's decisions did not require unanimous consent except in the specific categories the document listed, which did not include the decision to pledge LLC assets as collateral. She found nothing she could call a smoking gun, not until page 14. She set the document down and stood it up and went to make more tea, which she did not intend to drink any more than she had drunk the first cup. But the act of making tea was a way of moving her body through the kitchen while her mind worked, and she had always found that her best thinking happened when her hands were doing something routine. She filled the kettle. She stood at the counter while it heated. She thought about what she knew. What she knew was this: the date on page 14 was wrong. Not wrong in the way that honest mistakes were wrong, not wrong because a paralegal had pulled the wrong document from the wrong folder on a busy day. Wrong in a way that required the right document to exist and to have been overlooked. The 2019 amendment was the current instrument. It had been executed, witnessed, and notarized. It was in Sylvia's files. It was a matter of public record in the county where the properties were located. Any competent attorney preparing documents for a property transfer had an obligation to pull the current title chain and find the current trust instrument, and the current trust instrument was not the one being cited on page 14. She thought about what that meant. It meant one of three things. First possibility, Garrett's attorneys had not pulled a current title search, which would be a serious professional failure for a firm of Blackwood and Finch's standing. Second possibility, they had pulled the search, found the current instrument, and made an honest error in using the old one, which was possible but strained credulity given the amount of money involved. Third possibility, they had found the current instrument and had chosen for reasons they would have explained to themselves in whatever language, made it comfortable to use the older one. The third possibility was the one she sat with the longest, because it was the one that explained Garrett's conversation through the window. A man who did not know about the October 2019 amendment would not have been so certain on a Thursday evening that everything was already done. A man who knew about the amendment and understood its implications would know that using the 2018 document was the only way his plan could proceed, because the 2019 document would stop it before it started. A man who knew about the amendment and chose the 2018 document anyway was a man who had decided at some point in the planning of this that the risk was acceptable because the woman whose name appeared in the 2019 amendment as the instrument's guardian was not the kind of woman who would look at page 14. She poured the boiling water over the tea bag and watched it steep and thought about the kind of woman she was. She was a woman who had read the fine print of other people's intentions for 34 years and had made a career of finding what they hoped wouldn't be found. She was a woman who had been underestimated, not maliciously for the most part, but in the ordinary way that people are underestimated when what is visible about them is the soft edges and what is not visible is the professional precision underneath. She was a woman whose husband had known all of this about her, had married her in part because of it, and had made sure before he left that the legal structures he built were worthy of her attention. She picked up the document and went back to the table and kept reading. Section 8, subsection C, transfer of assets. The provision identified the source of the capital contribution, the land she was being asked to convey to the LLC, and it cited the legal instrument under which that land was currently held. The trust referenced was the Clifton Winslow Revocable Trust as amended May 11, 2018. She read the date twice. Then she set the document down very carefully the way you set down something you don't want to disturb and sat with it. The 2018 amendment was clean and straightforward. It named Dorothea as primary trustee, Pamela as secondary, and outlined a standard beneficiary structure that had been adequate for what it was at the time. What it did not contain was Sylvia Morning's name anywhere in the document. What it did not contain was any clause about commercial encumbrance or collateral. And what it did not contain, which Dorothea recognized only now, as she sat at the table where her husband had eaten 40 years of Sunday mornings, was the provision Clifton had insisted on in October of 2019, that in any dispute between the primary and secondary trustees or in any transaction involving the disposition of trust assets, a neutral third party with full signatory authority, specifically Sylvia Morning, would have final say. Under the 2018 document with Dorothea as primary trustee and Pamela as secondary co-trustee, Garrett had an argument. If Dorothea refused to sign, he could attempt to demonstrate that Pamela as secondary trustee and a primary beneficiary of the trust had independent authority to authorize the transfer. It was not a certain argument. A good attorney could challenge it, but it was a real argument, and a man with a Friday deadline and a bridge loan that needed collateral before noon was a man who needed real arguments more than certain ones. He was planning to use her daughter's name as a secondary entrance if the front door stayed locked. She sat with that understanding for a long time. The tea went cold. The light in the kitchen shifted as the afternoon moved toward evening. Outside in the courtyard, the satsuma tree stood in the same place it had stood for 39 years, patient and green, doing what it had always done. She was still sitting there when she heard his voice. It came through the open kitchen window, clear in the evening quiet that follows a slow neighborhood afternoon. He must have come back for something left in the car, or parked again on the street for a call, not knowing her windows were open to the October air. She heard his footsteps on the front walk recognizable, and then his voice cutting the quiet with the brisk, assured cadence of a man who has moved on to the next item on the agenda. Warren, tell your contact at the bank the numbers check out. 4 parcels, River Oaks adjacent, unencumbered. Once we have the titles folded in, the bridge loan closes and the Hargrove Creek bleeding stops. A brief silence while he listened to the other end. She signs Friday. The lots go into the LLC by Monday. The bank gets the collateral, the loan is secured, and Hargrove Creek stops being a problem. Another short pause. It's done, Warren. It's already done. The sound of a car door closing. The start of the engine, deliberate and unhurried. The sound of it moving away down the street until it was gone. Dorothea stood at the open kitchen window with her hand flat on the wooden sill, feeling the cool evening air on her face. The courtyard was dark now. The satsuma tree Clifton had planted the year Pamela was born stood at the center of it, its fruit still green on the branch, its roots going down into the ground that Clifton had bought and paid for and protected, because he understood in a way that required no explanation what it meant to have a place in the world that was truly yours. It's already done, Garrett had said. The confidence in those 2 words was total. He had looked at Dorothea Winslow, assessed the composition of her grief and her love, and her desire to keep her family together, and he had priced it at a figure he believed he could afford. He had never once considered that the quiet woman who made him pecan pie and asked politely about his projects was the same woman who had spent 34 years reading the fine print of other people's intentions and finding reliably the place where the story stopped being what it claimed to be. She went to the telephone and called Fletcher Odom. Fletcher was Clifton's oldest friend, a man who had known her husband since they were both clerking for the same judge in the early 1970s, who had been at their wedding and at Clifton's funeral and at every significant occasion in between, a man whose presence in her life was so woven into the fabric of Clifton that she sometimes forgot they were two separate people. He picked up on the second ring, and his voice, when he recognized hers, shifted immediately into the particular register of a man who has been waiting for a call he didn't want to receive. "Dot," he said, "I was wondering when you'd call." "Fletcher," she said quietly, "tell me what you told Garrett about the bank." The silence on the line was long enough to mean something. Not deceptive, just the silence of a man choosing how to carry a weight he has been carrying alone. "I think," he said finally, "you had better come over." Fletcher Odom's house at the end of Bomar Street was the kind of house that looked exactly the same in every decade because it had been loved with consistency rather than trend. The porch light was burning when Dorothea arrived at 8:30. The front walk swept clean despite the rain, and Fletcher was already at the door before she reached the top step. He was a tall man who had lost an inch or two to age, but still carried himself with the particular uprightness of someone who had spent decades on a bench. His face deeply lined by decades of listening carefully to things that mattered, very familiar in the way that the faces of old friends become part of the furniture of a life. He did not say anything. He just held the door open. The living room was a museum of a long and particular friendship. Chess pieces mid-game on the board by the window, a Tuesday game interrupted and never resumed, which was unlike Fletcher, who finished what he started. On the mantel, a photograph Dorothea recognized from 38 years ago. Fletcher and Clifton on a fishing trip in the Texas Hill Country in 1987. Both of them holding up catches of undistinguished size and laughing about them with the abandon of men who have gotten away from something for a weekend. She had been to this house hundreds of times for 40 years, and it had never occurred to her until this moment how much of Clifton still lived in rooms where his friends had not yet stopped seeing him. Fletcher poured 2 small glasses of bourbon without asking and set them on the coffee table. He sat in the chair across from her. He looked, Dorothea thought, like a man who had been reviewing his own conduct and arriving at an honest verdict. "2 months ago," he began, his hands folded in his lap, "Garrett came to me. He said he had a family project in development, a compound for the Winslow women, a way to keep the family together on the land Clifton had assembled. He said he wanted to honor what you and Clifton had built, and he was asking only because he knew I still had contacts in the lending community." A pause that held more weight than a pause usually held. He asked if he still had my contact at Lone Star Capital. "And you did," Dorothea said. "I did. I've known Gerald Crane at Lone Star for 15 years. Good man." I gave Garrett the name and the introduction. "And then Garrett asked me to put in a good word. Said the project was solid, the land was unencumbered, the family was aligned." Fletcher looked at his glass, the way men look at things when they are not actually seeing them. "I called Gerald. I told him the Winslow properties were clean, that the family was in agreement with the project, and that I could vouch for the principals." He finally looked up at her. "I said those words, Dorothea. I said them because Garrett asked me to, and because I had no reason then to question what he was telling me. I should have called you first. I should have asked you directly. That's what I should have done, and I didn't do it, and I have been carrying that since the morning I started to understand what was actually happening." "Did the bank rely on what you told them?" "Gerald forwarded my note to the loan committee as part of the pre-qualification file." "So yes." Fletcher's voice had the measured quality of a man delivering an honest verdict about himself. "What you're telling me is that the family was not aligned. I had not been consulted. I had not been informed. And the trust document Garrett presented to his attorneys as the legal basis for the property transfer references an amendment that Clifton superseded 14 months before he died." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. The house settled around them in the particular way old houses settle, in the evening small sounds that were also a kind of company. "He told the bank a material untruth," Fletcher said finally. "The legal precision was not affectation. It was the vocabulary of a man trying to be exact about a serious thing. Through me. He used my name and my relationship with Gerald Crane to tell a federally regulated lending institution that a family had consented to a transaction that family had not consented to. Yes, that is what happened. Fletcher picked up his glass. This time he drank from it. What do you need from me, Dot? I need you to be willing to correct the record, she said. Not now. I'm not asking you to call Gerald Crane tonight. I'm asking you to be willing to tell the truth if and when it comes to that. You have my word. He said it without hesitation, without qualification, without any of the hedging that would have suggested he was measuring the cost of the commitment before making it. He said it the way Clifton would have said it. She had not slept well the night before going to see Fletcher. After coming home from the dinner party, after settling Addie in the guest room, after sitting alone at the kitchen table for longer than she had planned, she had finally gone to bed and had lain in the dark thinking about things that could not be unthought. The mind she had found in the years since Clifton died was not cooperative about the things it returned to. It went where it needed to go. That night it went to Garrett, and to the document, and to the date, and to the voice through the open window, and it would not leave those things until it had processed them from every angle. She thought about Clifton too. She had been thinking about Clifton in a specific way, about a version of him she had perhaps not fully appreciated when he was alive. The version with the handwritten list in Sylvia's office. The version that saw around corners she hadn't noticed were there. He had always been the one who liked the fine print, who found genuine interest in the clause that changed the meaning of the clause above it. She had been the professional, the one whose work required it. But Clifton had been the one who understood it as a kind of care, a form of attention to the future. In the years when they were acquiring the lots one at a time, she had asked him occasionally why he was doing it, what he was thinking about what he saw when he looked at those 4 parcels on the Timber Grove map he kept folded in his desk drawer. He had always said something modest. That land was solid, that you couldn't replicate it, that the neighborhood was changing, and he wanted to understand the change before it understood them. She had thought he meant the property values, the development pressure, the way the city was moving. She understood now that he meant something else entirely. He meant the specific danger of a future he could not see clearly, but could feel the outline of the way you can feel the shape of something in the dark without being able to name it. He had felt the outline of exactly what had happened, and he had quietly built a legal structure around it, and he had gone to his last appointment in his good blazer with his hand barely trembling, and he had made sure. She lay in the dark and thought I should have asked him more questions. I should have let him tell me what he was worried about instead of assuming I already knew. Understanding is not the same as asking, and asking is not the same as listening, and she had failed at some proportion of all 3. That failure was hers. It was not going to be fatal because Clifton had accounted for it, but it was hers. In the morning, she was up at 6:30 and dressed, and at the kitchen window with her coffee before the neighborhood fully woke. The satsuma tree in the courtyard stood in the gray early light, the way things stand when they are rooted deeply enough not to need the sun to remind them of their position. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her keys and drove to Sylvia's office. She drove home through streets still wet from the earlier rain, the city going about its evening business around her. She was thinking about the particular quality of the shame that comes from having trusted the wrong person. Not Fletcher's shame, which was its own honest thing, earned and acknowledged. Her own, which was quieter and more complicated, a dull recognition that she had seen the usefulness of Garrett Breck in her family's grief and had called it love, had watched him fill the spaces Clifton's absence had left, and told herself that a man who filled spaces was a man who cared about the spaces. The next morning she went to see Sylvia Morning. Sylvia's office in Midtown had been in the same narrow converted Victorian building for 30 years. The floors registered your approach before you arrived, a quality the building had developed from long exposure to the careful footsteps of people carrying important matters. Sylvia's secretary, a woman who had been in that office for nearly as long as Sylvia, and who had the unruffled competence of someone who has processed very serious things for a very long time, showed Dorothea in without asking her to wait. Sylvia was already standing when she entered, positioned near the window that looked down into the building's small private courtyard, which was how Dorothea knew she had been watching for the car. "Sit down, Dorothea," she said, and the tone was the tone of a physician who has looked at the chart and is now managing the next hour carefully. Dorothea sat and laid out the facts. She had been ordering them since the night before, assembling them in the sequence that would make the pattern most legible. She used the flat sequential clarity she had used for 34 years when presenting a title defect, the dinner party, Addie on the curb, the words Addie had repeated in the car, the office with the door ajar, The document on the desk, the reading of page 14, the voice through the open window, and Fletcher's accounting of what he had said to the bank. She did not editorialize. She laid the facts on the table the way you lay documents on a table when the documents will speak for themselves if you let them. Sylvia listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the desk, her face arranged in the expression of someone who is receiving information and storing it exactly. When Dorothea finished, Sylvia was quiet for a long beat, and the quality of the quiet was the quality of someone choosing how to proceed with care. The arrogance of it, she said finally, the words measured and deliberate, to use the 2018 document, to not check my recorded notice. Either his attorneys didn't pull a current title search, which would be a serious professional failure, or they pulled it and chose to proceed anyway, which is something else entirely. She opened a drawer and removed a manila folder, which she handled with the precision of someone who has been keeping this ready. I want to show you something. Clifton asked me not to mention it unless the situation made it necessary. I believe the situation has made it necessary. She passed a single page across the desk. It was an addendum to the October 2019 amendment, separately initialed by Clifton, his initials written in the cramped, careful script he reserved for things that mattered, the script of a man making a record for posterity. Dorothea read it and felt something shift in her chest the way a long-held tension releases when the thing it was braced against finally arrives. Clifton had not merely protected the land, he had protected the protection. The addendum stated in clean, unambiguous language that if any party attempted to convey trust assets using a prior version of the trust instrument, the conveyance was automatically void from inception, and the successor trustee was immediately vested with full authority to challenge the transaction in any appropriate form. It was a provision designed to anticipate exactly the scenario that was now unfolding. Written by a man who had apparently thought through the chess game several moves ahead of anyone else at the board. He told me it was an abundance of caution, Sylvia said. I remember him smiling when he said it. It was the smile of a man who knows the difference between caution and foresight. He always did, Dorothea said. Furthermore, Sylvia continued, I filed a notice of trust with the Harris County Clerk's office in January of 2020, referencing this 2019 amendment by name and date. It is a public record. It is searchable. Any competent real estate attorney preparing documents for a transfer of these properties had an obligation, a professional and legal obligation, to find it before drafting a single page. And he didn't find it, Dorothea said. His attorneys didn't find it, or didn't look, or found it and proceeded regardless. Sylvia's expression was composed, but the edge underneath it was sharp. Any of those three possibilities creates a significant problem for Garrett Breck and for Blackwood and Finch. She paused. There is also the matter of what you overheard, the conversation about Hargrove Creek. If Garrett represented to the bank that these properties were available as collateral, when he knew they were held in a trust that contained restrictions on exactly that use, that representation has a name in federal lending law, and the name is not favorable. Dorothea nodded. What about Pamela? Sylvia's expression softened just slightly in the way of a woman who has been a lawyer for 30 years and has not lost the capacity for something more than legal precision. Tell me what you believe her involvement to be. I think she knows there are financial difficulties with one of Garrett's projects. I think he told her the compound would resolve them, and I think she made the choice not to ask the questions that would have required her to know what she was supporting. Dorothea paused. That is not the same as planning a fraud. No, Sylvia agreed, it is not. She's my daughter. I know that. What does that mean for Friday? It means I need to speak with her before then. She doesn't know that Garrett believes he can use her signature as co-trustee if I refuse to sign. He kept that from her, I'm certain of it. Sylvia studied her for a long moment. How are you certain? Because Pamela would not have let her daughter sit on a wet curb in the rain if she had understood what she was participating in, Dorothea said. She's done many things in this marriage that I've watched without comment. She is not that. Sylvia nodded once, a nod that closed the question and opened the next one. She told Dorothea what she intended to do on Friday morning in detail without omitting the parts that were uncertain, and Dorothea listened with the focused attention she brought to things that required it. She left the office in the late morning, walking to her car through air that smelled of the river and of the neighborhood's particular mixture of old money and old wood. On the way home, she stopped at the house of Mr. Aldridge, a retired notary of 68 years who grew tomatoes in his front yard and was known on the street as someone who could be counted on for the small dignities that communities require. She brought him a bag of pecans from her tree. They sat on his porch, and she asked if he would be willing to witness and notarize a simple written statement. He agreed without making it complicated. She took out a small index card and a pen. She wrote the date, then the words Addie had said to her in the car, exactly as she had heard them, the precise language of a child being truthful. Uncle Garrett said you'd sign the papers if I behaved. She signed her name at the bottom, attesting that she had heard these words spoken on this date in these circumstances. Mr. Aldridge read the card with the unhurried attention of a man who has read many important small things, took out his notary stamp, and brought it down on the card with a solid practice pressure. He signed his name beside the seal without ceremony or question. It was not a lawsuit. It was not going to send anyone to prison. It was a record, the kind of record that a woman who had spent 34 years understanding the power of written evidence knew how to create when the situation required it. A child had told a truth. That truth deserved to be recorded. She was watering her ferns that evening when Pamela knocked on the back door. Pamela looked like she had been fighting with herself in a small enclosed space for some hours and had arrived at an uneasy truce. The severe set of her jaw, the careful blankness of her posture, her good wool coat worn like armor rather than warmth. She was a lawyer. She knew what it looked like when a case was not going the way you needed it to go. She sat at the kitchen table without taking off the coat. Garrett told me you have retained Sylvia Morning, she said. Not as an accusation, not quite, but with an edge that was trying to become one. Come in, baby, Dorothea said, setting down the watering can sitting across from her daughter. Do you want tea? Mom, I'll make you tea. She did. She set it in front of Pamela and sat down with her own and waited. He says you're making this into something it isn't, Pamela said at last, the words arriving with the cadence of a line delivered rather than spoken. He says there may have been a small miscommunication about the timing of the paperwork, that's all. Did he tell you about Hargrove Creek? Dorothea asked. About the Phase 2 situation, about Warren Prudhoe coming to see me this morning. Pamela's hands on the table were still, but the stillness was the stillness of a person applying control rather than a person who doesn't need it. I knew there were some cash flow complications, she said. He told me the compound project would stabilize things, that the family investment would create the kind of equity base that would allow him to restructure. The family investment, it would create the collateral that would allow him to close a bridge loan that keeps Hargrove Creek from going into default, Dorothea said. She said it without inflection as a correction of a factual error. The compound may or may not be built. The loan will be closed. Those are different things, Pamela, and the documents he wants me to sign reflect the second thing, not the first. Pamela looked at the tabletop, the tea steamed between her hands. He's my husband, she said finally, her voice dropping into something that was not the lawyer's voice or the daughter's voice, but something younger and more unguarded. I don't want to lose my marriage over a business complication. I know that, Dorothea said. She reached across the table and covered her daughter's hands with her own. I need to tell you something that Garrett chose not to tell you, and I need you to hear it clearly so you can make your own decisions with full information. She paused. The 2018 trust amendment, the one his attorneys used, named you as secondary co-trustee. Under that document, if I refuse to sign, Garrett believes he could argue that you as co-trustee have independent authority to authorize the transfer without my consent. The color left Pamela's face in a way that told Dorothea everything she needed to know about whether her daughter had been informed. He didn't tell you that, Dorothea said. Not a question. No, the word came out very quietly. He was keeping it in reserve. He needed you in a position where if I wouldn't cooperate, you could be asked to step in without having had time to think it through. He needed you not to make a choice yet, because once you understood the full picture, you would ask questions that would complicate the timeline. Pamela sat with that for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and went silent. What did Addie say to you? Pamela said at last. In the car that night. What exactly did she say? Dorothea told her. The exact words in the exact order with the exact weight a 6-year-old gives to things she has been instructed to say. Pamela did not cry. She absorbed it the way a person absorbs something that explains finally the faint wrongness they have been sensing in the walls of their house for some time without being able to name it. She nodded once very slightly. She stood up. At the door, she stopped, and for a moment she stood with her back to the room, looking out at the dark courtyard, the shapes of the garden Clifton had kept. Dad used to sit in that chair every Sunday morning, she said. She did not look at the chair. I used to come downstairs and find him there with his coffee and the paper, and I remember thinking that was just the way Sunday mornings worked, that was what Sunday mornings were. A pause. I didn't understand until much later that somebody built that. She left. The door closed behind her with a quiet that was more final than a loud one would have been. The next morning at 7:45, the doorbell rang. Warren Prudo was on the front porch in a suit that said, "I am a serious person without being unkind about it." The kind of suit that has been selected to convey credibility without aggression. He was smiling with precision. "Mrs. Winslow, I apologize for the early hour. Garrett thought it might be helpful if we spoke briefly before the meeting this morning, just to make sure everyone is working from the same understanding." Dorothea stood in the doorway in her housecoat. She did not step back. "The bank has a window that closes at noon today," Warren Prudo said. "There's been a significant amount of work invested in this project over the past 8 months. The Hargrove Creek development alone represents a commitments from 40 families who've made substantial deposits in good faith. If the bridge financing doesn't close on schedule, those families are looking at a very difficult situation through no fault of their own." The 40 families, deployed with the skill of a man who understands that an abstract financial problem becomes a moral problem when you attach human faces to it. "Mr. Prudo," Dorothea said pleasantly, "are you an officer of the lending bank? Or are you a principal investor in Hargrove Creek Phase 2? Something in his face adjusted a small recalibration that was over before it fully began. "I'm an investor in the Hargrove Creek project alongside Garrett. So you're not here representing the bank's interests. You're here representing your own." She let that sit for exactly 1 second, the single second that was sufficient. In 34 years of reading title documents, I found that anyone who describes a significant legal decision as a formality is either a fool or a liar. "I don't believe you're a fool, Mr. Prudo." She reached for the door. "I'll see everyone at 10 o'clock at Sylvia Morning's office." She closed the door. She dressed carefully with the deliberateness of a woman who understands that appearance is part of strategy. Navy blue dress, well-tailored, the dress she wore when she wanted to look like what she was, a respectable woman of a certain age, someone's grandmother, someone whose formidable professional history was not visible unless you already knew to look for it. The pearls Clifton had given her for their 30th anniversary. Low-heeled shoes. She looked in the bedroom mirror and saw exactly what Garrett Breck would see when he walked into that conference room, a soft-edged widow whose leverage was sentiment and whose resistance was expected to dissolve under the warm application of reasonable language and time pressure. Good, let him see exactly what he expected. She placed the notarized index card in her handbag. She placed beside it the certified copy of the October 2019 amendment. She picked up her keys and drove to Midtown. Part 3. The record. The drive to Midtown took 18 minutes at that hour, the city moving at the rhythm of a Tuesday that did not know it was anything other than a Tuesday. She drove with the particular attention she had always brought to things that required it, hands easy on the wheel, eyes on the road, the rest of her mind running over the sequence of the morning one final time. Not because she was uncertain, because she had always believed that preparation was not the enemy of confidence, but its precondition. You prepared so that in the moment itself you could be present rather than rehearsing. She was prepared. Sylvia was prepared. The documents were in order, and the record was clear, and the foundation was solid. What remained was simply to let the structure stand. She parked in the garage adjacent to Sylvia's building and walked the half block to the entrance, with the unhurried ease of a woman who has nowhere else to be and nothing else to do, who has committed herself completely to the next 2 hours and is at peace with that commitment. The morning air smelled of coffee from a shop on the corner and of the particular clean coolness of an October in Houston that has decided to behave like October rather than August. A good day for the end of something. A good day for the beginning of whatever came after. Sylvia was standing at the conference room window when Dorothea arrived, looking down at the small private courtyard below, where a live oak had been growing in the same corner of the same brick enclosure for longer than either of them had been practicing their respective professions. The conference table had been set with the austere precision that Sylvia brought to things that required it: a leather portfolio, a water pitcher, 2 glasses, the table cleared of everything else. The absence of clutter was itself a statement about who controlled the room. Ready? Sylvia asked without turning from the window. Clifton made me ready in October of 2019, Dorothea said. I've just been catching up. Sylvia turned from the window, and for a moment the two women looked at each other across the clean expanse of the conference table, and what passed between them was the particular understanding of people who have served the same person and understood the depth of what that service meant. They heard the front door at precisely 10 o'clock. Garrett's voice in the reception area carried the easy authority of a man who expected rooms to configure themselves around his arrival. Then Pamela's voice quieter, answering the secretary's greeting with the courtesy of someone performing normality at some cost. Then footsteps on the old stairs. They came in together, which Dorothea noted as a choice. Garrett was in his best suit, the briefcase in his left hand, his face arranged in the expression of a man who has done this many times and expects to do it again. Behind him came Pamela, pale and carefully composed in a gray suit that was technically appropriate for any professional occasion and therefore revealed nothing about her feelings by its choice. And behind Pamela, which was not in the plan, came Warren Prudhoe. He stood just inside the door with the expression of a man who has decided to occupy a room by simply being in it until someone with sufficient authority asks him to leave. Sylvia looked at him for 2 seconds with the expression of someone making a quiet calculation. Mr. Prudhoe, this is a legal proceeding between the parties to this trust. You're welcome to wait in reception. Warren Prudhoe held his position. Garrett asked me to be here for support. I understand, Sylvia said. She did not say anything else. She simply moved to her chair at the head of the table and sat down. And in doing so, she claimed the geometry of the room in a way that left Warren Prudhoe standing near the door in a position that was either a deliberate choice to challenge something reasonable or an acknowledgement that he didn't belong at the table. He took a chair at the far end, far enough to be technically present, close enough to hear everything. Garrett sat directly across from Dorothea. He met her eyes and gave her the smile that had been charming for 10 years of family dinners and holiday weekends, the smile of a man who is confident that this will go the way he has planned it. Dorothea looked back at him with the expression she had always used for difficult documents, patient, attentive, and entirely without sentiment. Outside the window, the city moved through its morning. In the courtyard below, a bird was working through a repetitive sequence of notes with the focused application of an amateur practicing something difficult. Garrett opened his briefcase with the small click of its brass latch and laid 2 copies of the blue document on the polished table with the smooth assurance of a man depositing something valuable. Shall we begin? Sylvia did not touch the documents. She looked at them for a moment and then looked at Garrett. Before we address the partnership agreement, I need to establish several matters of record. She opened her portfolio. Mr. Prudhoe, I want to confirm for the record that your presence here is not on behalf of any lending institution. You are a private investor in Hargrove Creek Phase 2 with a personal financial stake in the outcome of this meeting. Is that an accurate characterization? Warren Prudhoe's expression recalibrated again that small, precise adjustment. I'm here in a support capacity. I'll note that as a yes. Sylvia extracted the certified copy from her portfolio and placed it on the table with the clean, decisive placement of someone who has been planning this moment. Mr. Breck, the agreement you've submitted references the Clifton Winslow Revocable Trust as amended May 11, 2018. Your firm at Blackwood and Finch had access to the Harris County Clerk's public filings. In January of 2020, Vargadib filed a notice of trust with that office referencing the October 17, 2019 amendment to this trust. She pushed the document across the table. It stopped precisely in front of Garrett. This is the instrument that governs the disposition of these properties. Garrett looked at the document. He did not pick it up right away. There was a pause, and in the pause, Dorothea could see the specific moment when a man who has been building on a particular piece of ground understands that the ground is not where he believed it to be. The pause lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than Garrett Breck usually needed to decide how to respond to a development. He picked up the document. He read the cover sheet. He read the date at the top. He set the document down and took out his phone and made a call. The conversation was brief. He spoke less than he listened. When he ended it, he set the phone face down on the table and looked at Sylvia with an expression that had rebuilt itself into something composed. My counsel advises that this amendment may be contestable, he said. Mr. Winslow's mental capacity in October 2019 was compromised by his cardiac treatment protocol. His medication at that time is known to affect cognitive function. There may be grounds to challenge the testamentary capacity at the time of execution. The room was completely still. Then Pamela said, "Garrett, stop." Two words level and quiet, carrying the weight of everything she had thought about since the night before. Garrett turned to look at his wife. Pamela's voice when it came was the voice of a woman who has made a final decision and is past the point of managing the impression it makes. "I drove him to that appointment. I drove my father to Sylvia's office on October 17th, 2019, and I sat in the reception area and waited for 2 hours while he went through those documents with the care he brought to everything that mattered to him. When he came out, he was tired because he was always tired that year. And he walked slowly because walking slowly was what the year had made of him. And he came to where I was sitting and he said, 'I took care of the land, Pamela. Your mother is protected.'" His mind was not compromised. His body was failing him, and his mind was exact, and he knew the difference, and so did everyone who was there. She looked at her husband with the steadiness of a person who has been waiting for a moment of clarity and has finally had it. "If you stand in a courtroom and call my father mentally incompetent, I will also be standing in that courtroom, and I will say exactly what I just said to you." Garrett held her gaze for a count of 3. What he found there was not the Pamela he had been working with for the past several months. He looked at his phone. He looked at the window. Warren Prudo at the far end of the table looked at his watch. Sylvia continued as though the foregoing had been a weather event, something that occurred in past. "The 2019 amendment establishes 2 provisions that are directly dispositive of your proposal. The first names me as successor trustee with full independent signatory authority on any conveyance or encumbrance of trust assets. Without my signature, any transfer of these properties is void regardless of what any other named trustee may execute. Your document omits this entirely. The second provision is what Clifton specified as the legacy clause. It prohibits the use of trust properties as collateral for any commercial third-party loan. It was written to prevent exactly the use you are proposing. Your bridge loan, Hargrove Creek Phase 2. Those are the very facts the clause was designed to anticipate." Warren Prudo stood up. He moved with the unhurried decision of someone who has done the calculation and is leaving before the math gets worse. He looked at Garrett briefly. "I need to make some calls." He did not look at Dorothea or Sylvia or Pamela. He walked to the door, opened it with the careful quietness of a man who does not want the sound of a door to become a statement, and pulled it closed behind him. No one at the table watched him go. Dorothea reached into her handbag. She placed the notarized index card on the table. It was a small object among the large documents, 3 inches by 5 inches, covered in her ordinary handwriting, its importance not legible in its physical scale. Garrett looked at it. His face, for the first time since he had walked into the room, lost its constructed quality. Pamela leaned forward. She read the card. She read it again. "Uncle Garrett said you'd sign the papers if I behaved." Below the sentence, Dorothea's signature attesting to what she had heard. Below that, the notary's seal and the notary's name. Below that, a second attestation from Bet neighbors who had seen Addie sitting alone on the curb in the rain before she called Dorothea and who had signed a brief separate statement to that effect. Pamela set the card down on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that has weight it doesn't show. "Garrett," she said. Her voice had shed everything it had been carrying and become simply what it was, the voice of a woman who needed an answer to a straightforward question. "Where was Addie when I was at the party inside the house?" Garrett looked at his wife. He looked at the card. He looked at the door Warren Prudo had used. He rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand, a gesture that was entirely unrehearsed, the gesture of a man reaching for a composure that has temporarily left the building. "She was being dramatic," he said. "She'd had a difficult moment at dinner before the guests arrived. I asked her to step outside for a few minutes to calm down. She made it into something it wasn't. She was 6 years old," Dorothea said. Her voice was level and did not require volume to carry. "She was sitting on the curb in the rain in front of her own house. She was not crying. She was not trying to come back inside. She was sitting still with the patience of a child who had been given a clear instruction and intended to follow it because she loved the people who gave it and wanted to do what was right. When I pulled up, she came to my car, the way someone comes to something they have been waiting for a long time and did not want to ask for. She looked at Garrett steadily. She understood that she had been placed outside for a purpose. The purpose she understood was that her sitting quietly in the rain was connected to whether I would sign a paper. The part she did not understand was why a grown man needed a 6-year-old child's compliance to obtain a signature from her grandmother. Garrett said nothing. You used her goodness, Dorothea said. You used the goodness of a child who trusted you. You told her that her behavior determined her grandmother's happiness. That is a sentence that should not exist in any child's understanding of the world, and you put it there. The quality of the silence in the room had changed completely. The room that had entered the meeting as a space for a business transaction had become something else, a space where several people were standing in the rubble of different versions of a story they had each been telling themselves. Sylvia's voice when it came was the voice of someone calling a proceeding to a close. There will be no signing today, Mr. Breck. The Winslow Trust will not be participating in this LLC now or in any restructured form that involves these properties as collateral. I recommend you notify Lone Star Capital before noon that the collateral they were pre-qualified against is unavailable. I also recommend a candid conversation with your attorneys about what their title search did or did not locate in the Harris County Public Record. Garrett sat with the 3 objects in front of him, his document perfectly assembled on a faulty foundation. Clifton's final amendment, 40 years of a man's foresight rendered in precise language, and the small index card with a child's sentence which he had not anticipated and which had no clause in any of his carefully prepared documents that could neutralize it. You could have just said no, he said. His voice had lost its scaffolding. What remained was something smaller and more honest. You didn't have to do all of this. I didn't do this to punish you, Dorothea said. I did this because you used a child and because you built your entire structure on a version of my husband's wishes that he had already replaced, and because I heard you through my kitchen window on a Thursday evening telling someone that my land was already handled. And in that moment I understood that you had never once actually thought about what my husband spent 30 years building. She looked at him across the table with no anger in her face and no triumph, only the steady regard of someone telling a true thing. He bought those lots one at a time, Garrett. He skipped vacations. He drove the same truck for 11 years past the point where a new one would have been reasonable. He brought his lunch to work every day in a paper bag that Pamela decorated with crayon drawings when she was 7 years old, and he ate that lunch at his desk and he saved the money. And he bought the land, and he never once told anyone about any of it because he wasn't doing it to tell anyone. He was doing it because he understood that the most important things are the ones that hold everything else up. Her voice remained even. You looked at what he built, and you saw collateral. I looked at it, and I saw the lunch bag. Garrett sat with him. He was a man of real intelligence, and he understood what had been said to him, and he knew it was true, and he did not have a response to it that was adequate. Some sentences are like that. They don't leave room for a reply button. Pamela stood up. She moved slowly with the careful deliberateness of a person who has been very still for a long time and is learning the use of motion again. She picked up her purse. She looked at her husband with an expression that was not anger, not contempt, but the particular clear-eyed understanding that is sometimes worse than both because it is the end of a certain kind of hope. Why didn't you just ask me, she said. Very quiet, very direct. If you were in trouble, if the project was bleeding, if you needed help. I am a lawyer and I am your wife, and you could have come to me with the actual problem and I would have tried to find a way to help you with it. I would have tried. She paused. Why didn't you just ask me? She waited genuinely as if an answer that made sense might still arrive. It didn't. She nodded once almost to herself and walked to the door. The sound of it closing behind her was the smallest possible sound in the room. Sylvia gathered her documents and rose without ceremony. My office will be in formal contact with Harris County regarding the recorded trust interest. If you have further questions about the scope of the trustee's authority, you are welcome to have your counsel contact mine. She walked out through the interior door and did not close it, leaving Dorothea and Garrett in the room alone. He was sitting with the posture of a man from whom something structural had been removed, the frame of something still standing, because frames are made to stand even after the rest is gone. She's going to leave me, he said, not to Dorothea, not to anyone in particular. Dorothea picked up her handbag. She stood for a moment looking at him with the dispassion of someone who has finished a hard task and is past the point of having feelings about it. The land will still be there tomorrow, she said. It will be there in 30 years. That is what Clifton was building toward. She walked to the door. He didn't build it so someone could stop bleeding. He built it so no one in this family would ever have to bleed for want of a place to stand. She left. The parking garage was cool and quiet. She sat in her car with the engine off, her hands in her lap, looking at the neutral gray of the concrete wall in front of her. She was thinking about Clifton, who had sat in Sylvia's office with a handwritten list in a slightly trembling hand and a mind that was exact, and had spent 2 hours making sure that the thing he had built could not be dismantled by a man he had never fully trusted. He had done it without drama. He had done it in an afternoon. He had not told her the full extent of it because he had not wanted to worry her, and because he had trusted her to be the person she was when the moment came. The most important documents he had once told her are the ones no one thinks to look for. She thought about something Clifton had said to her early in their marriage, one of those conversations that turn out to be more true than either person could have known at the time. He had said that the most dangerous thing in any transaction was the assumption of good faith without foundation. Not that good faith was wrong. Good faith was necessary. But extending it before the other party had demonstrated that they held the same understanding of what was being built. That premature extension was where people lost things they could not recover. He had been talking about a property deal gone wrong for a colleague of his. She had been 29, and she had nodded and thought she understood. She had not fully understood until today. He had not been talking about property. He had been talking about everything, about the difference between the trust that is given as a gift before it is earned, because you want to believe in the version of the future where it is warranted, and the trust that is built slowly by the accumulation of evidence that the other person holds the same values about the same things. The first kind is offered. The second kind is constructed. The difference between them is exactly the difference between the document that assumes everything is in order and the document that has been read. She had been in the business of reading documents for 34 years. She had read this one, and the title was clear. She started the car and drove home. In the weeks that followed, the city went about its business, and the autumn deepened, and the Breck Group suspended operations pending restructuring, and the Hargrove Creek Phase 2 receivership was reported in a brief item in the business section that Dorothea read at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with her second cup of coffee. She felt something she did not have a precise word for. Not satisfaction, which would have been too easy. Something more like the feeling after the long work of a difficult case is finally closed. A relief at the completion. A recognition that completion is not the same as healing, and a quiet alertness to the distance between them. Warren Prudhoe sent a letter through his attorney, 3 paragraphs of careful language. She accepted it without response and filed it with the other documents from that week in the folder she had labeled simply October, which was the month Clifton had made his last quiet provision against the future. Fletcher called on a Friday. He apologized again thoroughly and without excuse. She told him the apology had been made and received, and that what she required now was only the chess game on Tuesday in the 40 years of friendship that had never needed an apology before this one. Bet neighbors came over on a warm evening a week after that, and they sat in the back garden without talking much, which was the way the deepest forms of company sometimes work. The fireflies came out as the light faded, moving through the garden in their intermittent language, and Bet said without particular introduction, "He told me once that he married you because you were smarter than him." Dorothea looked at her. Clifton said that, "At your 25th anniversary, I was standing by the punch bowl, and he was watching you across the room, and he said it out loud like he was just noticing something true. He said it the way men say things when they mean them absolutely and are not asking for a response." Bet smiled a smile that held 40 years of witnessing a marriage from the outside. He said it like it was the best decision he had ever made, and he was still pleased about it. Dorothea looked at the satsuma tree. The fruit was turning the green, just beginning to show its first wash of orange at the tips. Clifton had planted it because he had read that satsumas were patient fruit, that they took their time revealing themselves and then arrived all at once. He was smarter than he gave himself credit for, Dorothea said. 3 weeks after the meeting in Sylvia's office, a letter arrived in the morning mail from a family law firm. Pamela had filed for divorce. Dorothea sat at the kitchen table and held the envelope for a while before opening it, and then held the letter for a while after reading it, and then set it down and made a cup of tea and drank it, standing at the kitchen window, looking at the courtyard and the tree and the 4 lots that ran together in the afternoon light. the unencumbered land that Clifton had built into an inheritance. She called Pamela that evening. Pamela answered on the fourth ring with the voice of someone who had been expecting the call and had prepared for it and was getting through the preparation. "I got the letter," Dorothea said. A pause. "I'm okay, Mom," Pamela said. Her voice was careful and exhausted, and underneath both of those things was the very faint sound of a person beginning to locate their own footing in after a long time of standing on someone else's. "I know you are," Dorothea said. "I was calling to tell you I'm here." A shorter pause. "Mom's home." Pamela said Addie has been asking about making beignets with her Nana. The burning came to the back of Dorothea's eyes the way it always came without warning, and with a warmth that was not entirely grief. "My powdered sugar," she said, keeping her voice steady, because it was important to keep her voice steady, "is ready whenever she is." They came on a Saturday morning in the last week of October. Pamela carried a bag of groceries, and Addie carried the blue dinosaur backpack and ran straight to Dorothea and wrapped both arms around her knees the way she had done since she was 3 years old, total and unconditional, the greeting of a child who has not yet learned to measure the appropriate distance for affection. Pamela and Dorothea stood in the doorway for a moment looking at each other. There was no speech prepared, no formal accounting of what had happened and what it meant and where they were going from here. Those conversations would come in their own time and in their own way. What there was in the doorway of the house built on 4 parcels of carefully acquired land was a mother and a daughter who understood each other with the unsparing clarity of people who have been through something together and are both still there. They set up at the kitchen counter. Pamela made coffee with the ease of someone who has made coffee in this kitchen for 40 years, who knows where everything is because she grew up knowing where everything was. Dorothea got down the mixing bowl Clifton had brought home from a church sale in 1988, a wide yellow crockery thing that he had loved for no explicable reason, except that he had said it looked like a bowl that expected to be used. Addie stood on the step stool in her sunflower apron and pressed both hands into the dough with the whole-body seriousness of someone performing important and difficult work. She talked while she worked, as Addie always talked while she worked, a continuous low monologue about the turtles she had seen in the canal on the way to school, and the book her teacher had read about a bear who slept a very long time and woke up and found everything changed and was not upset about it, and how she had told her teacher that her Nana had a tree in her garden with oranges on it that weren't orange yet. "Satsumas," Dorothea said. "Satsumas," Addie repeated with the gravity of a child who has received a correct piece of information and is storing it properly. The kitchen filled with the smell of hot oil and powdered sugar, and Pamela sat at the table with her coffee and watched her daughter and her mother, and her face held something that was not quite grief and not quite peace, but was the honest and particular expression of someone who is exactly where they need to be and is beginning to understand that. Dorothea watched Addie's hands in the dough and thought about Clifton. He had bought the first lot with money saved from 12 years of declined vacations trips they had not taken so that the money could do something more permanent. He had bought the second by selling the truck he had driven for 8 years and finding a cheaper one which he drove without complaint for another 7. The third required 2 years of careful daily saving, a period during which Dorothea had noticed small adjustments in his habits, the lunches he brought rather than bought. The appetizers he declined, the suits he wore until they were fully worn, and when she had asked him about it, he had said only that he was being careful with some things for a while. The fourth lot had come from a small inheritance from an uncle in Georgia whom Clifton had not known well, and he had come home on the afternoon the check cleared with the expression of a man who has completed a task he has been working toward for a long time, and he had sat in his kitchen chair and said quietly, "The land is complete, Dot. It's all there." She had asked him what he meant. He had said that a family needs a place that is genuinely its own, not leveraged against anything, not contingent on anything, simply present and solid beneath them, the way a good foundation is simply present and solid beneath a house, doing its necessary work without needing to be noticed or praised. Addie looked up from the dough with flour on the end of her nose and the delighted, slightly self-conscious expression of a child who knows she looks funny and is pleased about it. She looked at Dorothea with the open face of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to armor herself against the world and does not yet need to. "Am I doing it right, Nana?" "You're doing it exactly right," Dorothea said. She thought about the 3 objects she had placed on Sylvia's conference table. Garrett's partnership agreement, professionally drafted and entirely built on ground that wasn't there. Clifton's final amendment spare and specific, and 40 years of quiet foresight made permanent in language. And the small index card, a child's sentence notarized by a neighbor and witnessed by the faithful ordinary attention of people who watch out for each other on the same street year after year. The three objects on the table were doing what documents do when they are allowed to speak without interference. They were telling a story. Garrett's partnership agreement told the story of a plan built on assumptions about what a widow would and would not read, about what an old woman would and would not understand, about the gap between a professional reputation that had ended years ago and a capability that had not ended with it. Clifton's final amendment told the story of a man who had looked at the future clearly and had written down what he saw in language that could not be argued with. The small index card told the story of a child who had been told something she was meant to pass along and had passed it along with the perfect accuracy of someone who does not yet know that some things are better not delivered. Together, the three objects told the story that Dorothea had been reading since the Tuesday evening on the curb in the rain, the story that had assembled itself piece by piece with the methodical inevitability of a title chain that was always going to come out the same way regardless of which order you read it in. She looked at Garrett across the polished table. He was looking at the index card. She had thought coming into this room that she would feel something about him at this moment, some version of the anger or the grief or the disappointment that the preceding weeks had delivered in various proportions at various hours. She found that she felt very little. What she felt was the particular clarity that sometimes comes at the end of a long piece of work, when the documents have been assembled and the title is clean or is not clean, and there is nothing left to do but state the result. The result was clear. Pamela across the table had put the index card down and was looking at her husband with an expression that Dorothea recognized from her own life, from moments when she had understood something about a person that she could not ununderstand. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was the specific expression of a person who has been carrying a weight they did not entirely know they were carrying, and who has finally been shown the full scale of it, and whose body is adjusting to that knowledge in real time. She was her father's daughter. She was doing what Clifton would have done. She was being very still while the picture assembled itself. She was reading. Garrett had read their lives the way some people read contracts quickly, for the headline terms, trusting the structure to mean what it appeared to mean. He had seen the grief and the love and the desire to stay connected, and he had called it a solvable problem. He had never thought to look for the addendum, the carefully initialed provision set down in a quiet office by a man with a trembling hand in an exact mile, the provision that had been waiting in the public record for anyone patient enough to look. He had never understood that the most binding documents are the ones made in the ordinary faithfulness of people who watch out for each other, that the most durable foundations are built in the years when no one is watching one small piece at a time, by someone who is not doing it to be admired, but because he understands what it means to give the people he loves a place to stand. Addie pressed both palms flat into the dough and made a sound of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. In the courtyard, the satsuma tree was turning. By next week, the fruit would be orange. She thought in those weeks about the nature of the work she had done for 34 years and about what it had actually been for. She had understood it at the time as technical work, the work of precision and patience, of reading carefully and asking the right questions and finding the place where the chain of ownership broke. She had been good at it, and she had been proud of being good at it, and she had understood her pride as the pride of a craftsperson in a craft. She understood now that it had also been something else. The work of a title underwriter is the work of protecting the claim that ordinary people have to the places they have built their lives around. The work assumes that people can own things, truly and securely own them, that the piece of ground they have paid for and improved and planted and lived on cannot be taken from them by a cleverer person with a better attorney and a less careful reading of the title chain. The work is the mechanism that makes that assumption real. She had spent 34 years making it real for other people. She had been given at the end of it the opportunity to make it real for her own family on the ground her husband had spent 30 years assembling one careful piece at a time. She had not felt doing it like a person exercising professional expertise. She had felt like a person doing what was necessary to protect what was hers and her daughters and her granddaughters. The land beneath the house and the house's right to be there, the foundation that everything else stood on. That was what Clifton had been building toward. Not an asset, not an investment, a foundation, something that would simply be there year after year under the lives of the people he loved, doing its necessary work without needing to be noticed. He had been very smart about the future. She had married a very smart man, and she had not always given him full credit for it, and she was giving him full credit now at 74, standing in her kitchen window, looking at the satsuma tree that was beginning to turn orange, thinking you knew. You knew and you prepared and you trusted me to do the rest, and I did. That was what she would carry forward. Not the anger which had not been much, not the grief which had been considerable. The knowledge that the people who prepare quietly for futures they cannot fully see are the people who make it possible for other people to stand in their kitchen windows, watching their trees, knowing the ground beneath their feet is solid. The world rarely recognizes what is truly valuable, because some things carry a worth that can only be read by those who know where to look.